Welcome everybody to Whole Agency Roma Explained. Today we're going to go into some high-level Roma concepts, but in a way that relates Roma to everyone who works at the agency, and some of the ways that we contribute to performance management. David Knight's on the call with us today. He's CalCAPA's executive director. David, would you like to say a few words about the call for today?
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. Appreciate it. Glad everybody's here. We just have an opportunity to really start off the 2024 discussion around Roma. And one of the things that we want to give as an opportunity was to really talk at a high level of exactly what whole agency Roma looks like, what it entails, and how we describe that. So this is an opportunity just to try to touch on some of those bases. We plan to have a multiple series, in two different tracks as we go forward, which one is how can folks take extreme deep dive and maybe become the Roma implementer or the trainer for their agency and be kind of that Roma leader. But at the same time, ensuring that we continue to create opportunities for people that just want basic general Roma knowledge so that they can use that whatever their role is at the agency as well. So we try to do both of those to make sure that we're bringing performance management and those discussions to the forefront, and this is a part of that process. So glad to be here. Thank to see everybody's face. Lawrence, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thanks, David. Okay, so today we are going to take a look at how everyone in the agency absolutely plays a role in Roma. It's the performance of our agency. We'll define some of the terms that we use pretty regularly in Roma, and this training is intended for all levels of the agency, so we can use this as a tool to better acquaint ourselves with Roma, especially in advance of an introduction to Roma course or some other training that you may be doing locally at your agency. Today specifically, although Roma is a very, very broad concept, we're going to hone in on a few specifics so that we can have a conversation about how the agency participates. So our learning outcomes for today are first to define and follow the Roma cycle for performance management. It's the most basic form of Roma that we'll see, and it helps guide everything that we do. The second in line for that title is a logic model. So today we're also going to describe the purpose of logic models for connecting services to the community needs and how that works specifically. Then we'll take a peek into recognizing the difference between service outputs and then family agency and community outcomes. We find that this is a conversation that we have a lot, and today we've got some activities around that to help clarify those points. And then we'll wrap things up with connecting the dots between organizational roles and then connecting that to how we collect data and then how we report it back out. Sounds like a tall order, but we'll get through it. All right, and here's the Roma cycle. No, it's not the Roma cycle. This is the Roma cycle. So you'll see this format in a couple of different ways, but the words are generally the same. And in this order. So the Roma cycle is a way that we can take the broad strokes of Roma performance management and put them in a format that's pretty common in performance management structures. All right, we start at the top here with the assessment. We assess in a lot of different ways. The assessment that you're probably very familiar with is the community needs assessment, but we do all sorts of assessments on how it is that we're going to approach delivering services. And we need to start with an assessment so that we can learn the current state of families, the current state of our agency, the current state of our community. Okay, that'll lead into planning. So once we've assessed our population, then we get to move into planning. And in planning is when we get into a lot of the ways that we can connect those things that we've assessed into services. So we have to get an idea of the kinds of services that we're going to provide. And during that planning process, we're also looking at targets. So we're going to identify what we think success looks like during that planning process. The next phase, after we've got a plan in place, is to move into implementation of that plan. So that's when we're actually doing the services. This is sort of the fun part. This is when the rubber meets the road. We start to um, spend the dollars that we need to spend in order to provide the services that we need to provide, right? That's that part of the process of implementation. And as we're doing that, it leads us into the next part of the cycle, which is the achievement of results. Okay, so as we're implementing, we record those results. We'll talk about that today, about where, when, we record those results, a little bit of why we record those results, and then how it is that we use them in the next and final phase, which is evaluation. So we take a look at all those results, we evaluate how things are going, whether they're going as they're intended, if things have changed, if the results that we're seeing are what we're expecting or not. And then we roll that all up into the next assessment process. So we can check against our evaluation to see what we need to do for the next service cycle, right? And generally speaking, this rolls in a wheel, right? You can see how one piece leads into another, but there are always exceptions to this. There are times when we're going to pause in the middle of perhaps implementation to reassess what's going on. Maybe things are going in a way that we had not anticipated, and we need to take a pause and relook at that. And there are ways of doing that. So don't feel like this is locked in place and that the Roma cycle only goes in one direction. It does allow some room for moving around. And in more advanced Roma courses, we can get into how that looks and the future of rapid cycle learning and how that plays a role in this process. Okay, so we'll see that it can be more uh, advanced than this. But generally speaking, this is how Roma works in this cyclical format. David, do you have any other thoughts on the Roma cycle? Good? Okay. All right, rolling forward. Okay, so we've got a lot of different reasons why we might use this next piece. After we've got the cycle figured out, okay, then we use a logic model to describe the way that services and programs operate, okay? And it gives us a foundation for performance management. Right? What are you going to manage? Well, this is how we define that. This is a format for writing all that stuff down so that we've got our predictions in order, and then we can line up our results with those predictions. Okay, so a few times when you would want to use a logic model, well, lots of ways and lots of times that you want to use a logic model. First, funding applications. A lot of times funding applications will explicitly ask for a logic model. If they don't, it's good to include anyway, because it's a way of describing the results that you expect to get after leveraging those funds. It's a pretty simple format. It is one of those things where if you have logic models in place and you're able to provide some data behind your predictions, you're far more likely to win that funding application. There's lots of anecdotes around that, but specifically being able to draw a correlation between the dollars that are spent and the outcomes that you achieve is very attractive to funders. You'll reference your logic model for performance reports. In fact, you'll find that reporting is a part of the logic model. And as you're reporting on information, you're going to use content from the logic model. So it gets a little meta, but your reporting is included in how we anticipate tracking performance of the programs that we offer, the services that we offer. The logic model is interesting in that you can use it to demonstrate how you connect needs with services, right? We'll see that very, very soon. But when you identify needs in that assessment process, this is how we demonstrate that those needs are directly related to these services that we're offering, okay? The logic model also talks about the mission, not just of the agency, but it may also discuss the mission of a program itself, right? So when you start looking at your programs as having a mission or maybe a submission of the agency, it becomes very powerful when you're telling the story through the logic model. You'll use this logic model in budgeting because it is absolutely an area where you start to predict in numbers how many services you're going to offer, and then that leads to how much it will cost to offer them and how much you have available to work into those services. Storytelling is huge with logic models. A logic model is really a good outline of a story for the program. Okay, the more detailed you can get with the logic model, the more clearly you can tell the story of that program, and that everybody will be on the same page. It has the same foundational model. Everybody's working off of the same logic model, though we may tell slightly different stories. They're all based on the same data, the same information. Last couple, David, you want to take these last couple? Because we're looking at workforce and performance management through the logic model, and then also how the agency workflow and systems operate.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the discussions, we talk a lot about performance reports. So we think about maybe the CSBG annual report, or you may be discussing maybe a PIR, report that you do for Head Start or any of the programs that you have. You're using that system so that you can collect and understand the difference between services and outcomes. But also when we start talking about from an HR standpoint, being able to, if you're talking about a whole agency, using ROMA to set certain benchmarks. One of the things that we talk about quite a bit is how do we know, or how do all staff know if they're successful if we don't tell them what the targets they're trying to hit? And being able to use ROMA principles and having that across your agency allows you to help set those targets. So it also helps on the other side about creating that performance to say, well, we know we have an X amount of dollars in a grant. We know that we can hire this many people. We've been tracking these outcomes, so we know how many folks we can see, how many outcomes we can actually legit get. So in theory, typically, we always know that the amount of services we can operate are set by a budget. So if you have a $100,000 budget, you have enough money for a certain amount of services. You have 200,000, you may have a little bit more. So you are able to understand how much services you can offer, and using the ROMA principles, you're able to track. Well, on a typical basis, we're able to serve 100 people that 100,000, and out of that, we may get the 10 long-term outcomes that we're looking for. So you're able to set that, and if you have a different amount of staff in different departments, then you set an expectation, and you're able to manage your workforce towards those expectations based on the collection of that data. The second part of this is the agency workflow and system. So looking at maybe the way we set things up, how do we operate? How do we take in customers from the very, very beginning, from an original application all the way through the process of tracking an outcome on the very end? What does that process look like? And using these ROMA principles allows us to look at what is our workflow? What are some of the things that we could possibly change or do differently or combine in order to be able to reach better results? And so when we have these systems in place, these are two big factors that you're able to use when you're developing maybe that standard operating procedure to say, this is how we accept clients. This is how we work through these services from all these different departments that we have. And then everyone knows that this is what we're trying to achieve. So the ROMA and the use of a logic model allows you to really set that out and be clear when you're developing those processes. Thanks, Lawrence.
Sure. Okay, so here is a quick walk through a logic model. Now, generally speaking, when you see logic models in other ROMA courses, we put all of this on one sheet of paper with 8 columns on it. Okay, and that's a great format when you're processing a logic model, when you're working through one. If you want to learn a lot more about how to fill in a logic model, that's where the Introduction to ROMA course comes in very, very handy, and we'll go through that level of detail in that course. Today, I'd like to give you a quick overview as to what it is that we're recording in this logic model, because it relates to the different roles that we have throughout the agency. All right, you and your role may focus on different areas of the logic model more than some of your peers. So as we go through each of the columns, try to see where you and your role fit into this format. Okay. So the first thing that we record in a logic model comes out of our needs assessment. It's in the first column. We record what needs we start to recognize in three different areas, right? So we start looking at needs from individuals and family members from the community. We'll look at uh, and a little later on, I'll demonstrate for you how it is that we record some of these needs and what we use them for. But we will look at individual and family needs through that assessment process. But we won't stop there. We'll look deeper into the community to see where the community at large may have missing access to certain services or resources. And then we'll also look internally at the agency to see what our capacity to serve the community looks like, right? And if we have any needs there, okay? Once we know those needs, and this will feel a little weird, but this is how we do it in our training courses as well, is we go straight from the need and we skip over to the third column and we start to look at the outcomes. Because once we know a need, it's very easy to know what the outcome is. It's basically the opposite of the need. If the need is satisfied, then we have an outcome. All right. And that's the plain language that we try to steer toward so that we don't drift into services. And I've got a little activity for us later to help us differentiate what an outcome looks like versus what a service looks like. But know that that's what we're striving for. We're really looking to achieve outcomes based on that assessment, right? The way that we achieve those outcomes is going to be back in that second column. That's when we start to apply a service or some other activity to meet that outcome. So take it from a need to an outcome. And that's what the service is there to do, is to really convert that. And that's what we spend a lot of time budgeting for and applying our dollars at the agency level is to fund those services and those activities. But by how much? Well, that's more in the logic model. So we get a little bit more detail as we move along. So once we've identified the services that we're going to fund as an agency and to perform as an agency to help affect individuals and families, to help affect the community, or to help affect our agency itself, we needed to have an indicator of by how much, right? In order for this to be performance management, we need to be measuring some kind of performance. So for the indicator, what we're doing here is identifying our target. It's our specific what we're trying to achieve here with this service or outcome in the community, right? And we've got a very specific way that we format that so that we're able to track real numbers against real predictions, okay? So if we're identifying indicators as a predictor, and if we're guessing here in column 5 is where we're actually recording the results. And the reason why we've got a little star there next to the actual results is as we're building a logic model, we won't know those until later. So the idea here is that we're going to build 7 out of these 8 columns ahead of time, and then use that column 5 to record results as we go, okay? So when we start thinking about time frames for recording results, this is when we want to be specific about, is this a one-time deal, or are we looking for results over time and you want to do incremental recording? Anything's game here, but that's where we're going to record those results. The 6th column is that we identify what tools we're going to use to measure both outputs and outcomes. And I'll draw a clear distinction between those two here in a minute. But what we're looking at here is how do we record, or what measurement tool are we using to record the services that we're performing on the one hand, and then what measurement tool are we using to demonstrate that changes are being made on the other hand, which is outcomes. Right? So we look at measurement tools in 2 different categories so that we can identify from an output side what's going on, and then also from an outcome side what's going on. So we're measuring in two areas, right? Column 7 is where do we put that? Once we have recorded these things, where are we going to store all of that information? Okay. How is that collected? Who's going to collect that information? And then when are they going to collect it? Right. And then the last item is the frequency that we're going to turn around and report that information back to the parties that need to know, right? And who needs to know how well the services are doing? Everybody needs to know how well the services are doing, right? All of the stakeholders are interested in how well things are performing. If I'm a client receiving services, I want to know how well my services are being performed, right? So I'm going to have my own individual outcomes. Your funders are going to need to know how their dollars are doing, so they're going to have a vested interest in knowing the performance of the programs. Your board is going to have an interest in that. So as we move through and collect all of this information and data, we're also establishing when it is that we're going to use it, right? And in what formats we're going to use it. So your role in the industry in your agency is going to fall into one, probably way more than one of these columns. All right. In your role, you'll focus in on some areas. It's helpful to know all of the areas at a glance, so you know what your impact is on that model. Okay. David, what thoughts do you have on on the 8 columns here?
I'm sorry. I think you hit them all.
Yeah, I know. It's funny not to go too deep in them, but go for it.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is definitely what you said about being driven when you're doing this from an agency standpoint, is to think about your community, much like you do the needs assessment process. Think about your community from a whole, or think about what you're trying to achieve. And the hardest thing for us to do sometimes in this process is to kind of put down or put away the programs that we run. That's a typical thing. And so I always advise people, you kind of come in and clean the whole table off when you do this. And you're looking at this, when you're looking at both your processes and just thinking about Roma from a agency-wide standpoint, you say we want to build some logic models. One of the hardest things is not to really continue that. So that's the only thing I would put into these when you're thinking about each one of these columns. Again, try to erase everything and that's really difficult because you do want to use your experiences. You do want to use the knowledge you have from running programs to really start thinking about the indicators and your projected results and things like that. But prior to that, it's really thinking about the need and the outcome first, and then how do you build these models so that you can realistically track all this information. So thanks, Lawrence.
All right, real good. So let's get an example here. I'm gonna take a look at needs first, because I mentioned that earlier, that we look at need in a couple of different ways. This is an example that we like to use in education because it helps illustrate how we focus on 3 different elements when we look at needs, and you can define needs in 3 different ways. None of these are correct or incorrect in terms of like what you should or shouldn't include. It's all based on what you determine as a need from the responses that you receive in your surveys and in your focus groups and your community assessment. Okay, so if we look at education as an example, and let's say that there emerges an area of concern that there aren't enough high school graduates in the community. Okay. So this could present in a couple of different ways. First, from a family level, it could present that individuals do not have high school diplomas, right? That's where they're missing. In a community perspective, it may mean that the community has a low high school graduation rate. So when we go from that family to community level, right, from on the family level, we're looking at the individual who needs to achieve a high school diploma. Okay. And that's how we would approach that as a need. We would affect that need for that family member, and we would try to um, uh, provide that person with a high school diploma in some way. Okay, and that would be our mission. That would be how we try to affect that. If we're looking at it from a community perspective, our community has a low high school graduation rate. Well, now we're looking at a much larger challenge, right? Now we're trying to affect the graduation rate for the community. So our approach to that is going to be a little different. We may do a lot of the same things, but if we're tracking how we're doing with the graduation rate in the community and trying to affect that, it's going to be a different approach to tracking the results, right? Maybe the same services that we provide, but you're going to track the results of the different needs differently based on who's receiving the benefit. And then the last area is going to be the agency itself. So our agency has a need for additional resources to establish or expand GED preparation programs for adult customers who have not graduated high school. Here we're looking at the capacity of the agency. So it may be that the agency needs to focus on developing a GED equivalency program or something like that internally, or sourcing one, or finding a referral to one. But the agency itself is now who needs to achieve a result. Okay. David, do you have comments on the needs?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the comparisons that really helps relate to it's the idea of whether do we need CalFresh benefits or do we need to build a grocery store, right? So one of the ideas could be we've established the need that the families don't have access to food, right? Same way. Well, if we already have the program, we've already met the agency level. Let's say we do run a CalFresh program. And so we're handing those out because we said individuals do not have food, but there's no grocery store for them to spend the food at, then they just have CalFresh. It doesn't reach the outcome that you're trying to reach. So in this same situation that Lawrence described here, it's you have to really ask the right questions. And what's so important about establishing the level of need, the stronger we establish the level of need, the stronger our outcomes are likely to occur. And so you want to take time and don't shy away from that immediately, oh, that we don't have a community issue around education. It's fine. If you say, no, it's individuals have a low graduation rate. So, or if you say, excuse me, individuals don't have a diploma. So you can getting this information from a lot of different places, right? So that may be looking at the census data, and the census says we have an overall low graduation rate. But maybe you look at the client data that you have. So you're taking intake, you're taking demographics, and one of those questions is high school attainment, right? You're measuring their education level. And you say, well, actually, the folks that come in and see us don't have diplomas, but as a whole community, we're kind of okay. So that really tells me it's an individual, low-income individuals that we work with. It's a direct family issue. So it's really digging into that to understand that, but it's also going to really help you establish where you want to plan. And of course, as Lawrence said, there's always the third option, which is, hey, the community has the school system in place, right? Has the mechanisms to ensure we have graduation. We understand that individuals lack it, but before we can even get to that individual point, we have to write a grant or we have to work on a program that establishes that program first. And to think about that, sometimes that's something we skip over in our planning because we say, oh, all we have to do is write a grant, we get the money, we're able to do that. Well, you got to train people to operate it, right? You got to understand what the rules are. You got to get the regulations. And so we need to make sure as we're writing plans that we don't skip over that logic model first to say, well, we want to have a logic model that states our need is currently that we lack a GED preparation program. And then we'll talk about the outcome in a minute. But it's, again, taking that baby steps to say, we go out here and just say, we're going to have X amount of individuals attain a diploma. We haven't really written the process from a minor baby steps approach. Some of that gets lost, and then we don't have the outcomes that we want to have. So thanks, Lawrence.
Mm-hmm. All right. So there's a tendency as we start to build these things and start to identify the needs and write them down. There's this tendency to feel like, well, the individual just needs the service. I mean, that's what it is. At the end of the day, they need the service, and that we're trying to move away from that because it's not so much that they need the services, they need the outcome of the service, right? They need what the service offers. Okay. It could be pretty much any service that you put in there so long as it meets the needs. Let me demonstrate here. If we look at family individual needs, um, it may be tempting to say that the families need weatherization service. But weatherization service is a type of service. And I just said that we're not supposed to do that. So what is it that the families actually need? Well, the families actually need to resolve high utility bills, right? They have high utility bills. So that's what we need to affect. Okay. Now, maybe weatherization service that we use to do that, but that's the outcome that they affect high utility bills. Here's another one. Say families need rental assistance payments. I'm sure that they do. But what they really need is not the type of service. What they really need is, in this case, families are at risk of eviction. So they need to resolve this risk of eviction situation. That's how we know we're successful. One more. So individuals need job skills training. Again, that's a service. Job skills training is a service. So what they're really, really looking for, you can see where this is going, is that the individuals just lack the job skills. Okay, when they achieve the job skills, then we know that we've succeeded. All right. So that's individuals. There's a couple other categories though. Okay. So besides individuals, we've got communities, right? We talked about a community level need. Well, community level need, we're not so much looking at the service itself as the strategy that we're trying to put in place to achieve that community need. So here's what I mean by that. So if our community needs to develop summer programs for youth, well, why do they need to develop summer programs for youth? That's not really the need. That's going to be the strategy to address the need. But the real need of the community is that the community does not provide access to summer programs for youth, right? It's not even available. The community is responsible for making it available. It's not available. Okay. Here's another one. If our community needs to build affordable housing, okay, who doesn't need to build affordable housing, right? Okay, so that's a strategy, but what's the real need in the community? Well, the community is limited affordable housing. That's how that's going to present. Okay, is that we don't have enough. Maybe we build it, maybe there's some other way of affecting that, but the need that needs to be addressed is the limited affordable housing. Last one here for the community is that it needs to provide job training skills. We've identified that as a strategy to provide the job training skills. What we're really looking for is that the community lacks opportunities for job skills training. There may not be a job skills training center or the availability to achieve job skills training in some other way. That's what the community needs, right? Okay, we can maybe provide job skills training and that could satisfy that, but that's not the need. Okay, that's the service or the strategy. All right. And then that last area is the agency itself. When you're looking internally at the capacity of the agency, okay, this is how this might look for agency strategies. It may look like our agency needs to provide employment services so our customers do not have to go to another agency. Okay. Seems like that would be the case, but that's the strategy. What the agency really needs is that the agency lacks the trained staff to provide employment services. So that's the real need there. If we were to affect that need, then we would be addressing employment training or the staff training. Okay, upskilling staff to provide the services. Another example, our agency needs to establish shelter services for the homeless. That's a strategy. That's something that you might do. But the need that you're addressing is that the agency does not have resources to provide shelter services for people experiencing homelessness. Okay. And then last one, I hear this all the time. I think it's every week, David. Like we need more childcare slots. That's a big deal. Yes, that's a strategy. But the real need that the agency has is that the agency is not funded to provide childcare for everyone who applies for services. That's the battle you're fighting there. Okay, so you need the funds, and then maybe you can provide more childcare slots, but the funding is what you're chasing, right? All right. I'll pause here. David, do you have thoughts on the past three slides here?
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, everybody says, why do you get into this wording? Why is this important? Well, the hardest thing that we find in community action, the work that we do, whether it's community action or just CBOs in general, is being able to very clearly identify what our successes are and be able to tell our story. And so when you start identifying needs as strategies or services, then when you start talking about outcomes, the language is we're successful because we built that strategy or service. Is that really true? Well, not necessarily. The outcome, the result, the language of success, right, is the increased resources on the agency level. It's the opportunity that you create at the community level. It may be the family actually having that outcome. And again, if it says, we lack childcare slots, our agency needs more childcare slots, then you create more slots, you consider that successful. But it's a different discussion. What you're trying to say is that now that you have the funding for those childcare slots. So it can get really, really into the weeds on some of these, especially at the agency level. Again, the point is that you are able to decipher between the three. And I wanted to answer the question, if I may, Lawrence. It says, how do you determine which level of need to focus on, or is it best to focus on all three? Great question. Sometimes you may be able to focus on at multiple levels. What we always want to realize, though, is don't immediately say it's all three. Take a time. One of the strategies that we use is what we call the 5 whys. So if you realize that there is a gap, you realize that there's not a success the way you want for your families, you're starting to ask those questions. So in the education one, you say individuals that we serve lack a GED or a high school diploma. Well, you say why? Well, it's because they don't have access to it, right? And you say, no, well, that's not it. There's a GED training center across the town. Okay, well, is it that our agency doesn't know how to refer? So that would be an agency level need, right? Our agency lacks the ability to refer to the GED, or we don't have an MOU. Then it's like, oh, no, we have that. We have all that set. So then it really would just be a family level need. And I'll tell folks, most of the time, if you dig deep enough, you want to make sure you've hit the agency, or excuse me, the community level resources there, then the agency, then the family. But we have such a tendency a lot of times to just focus in on the family. We say the family lacks a GED, we need to get them a GED, and we don't take time to really write out that plan. So I hope that answers your question, is to really dig down and say, no, it's really met. And I want to say one thing too, part of your process, this is important when you're asking questions to gather information, when you're doing your needs assessment process, you're trying to understand what your agency really needs to work on. That's how you ask those questions as well. If you just ask people, do you think education is a priority? Well, most people are going to say yes. But if you ask questions like specifically around certain populations, because you have certain information to say how we're forming those questions, it's, do you feel like you have the ability to access additional education if you so chose to? They may say no, then you start to say you're digging into those questions. You're really trying to identify what that is. Because again, we get a lot of assumptions, and assumptions are very good when we're using our experience and our data and our information to establish the need. But sometimes we assume, based on the walls that we work in, that if we just jump right to giving that family a service, we'll be okay. But a lot of times it's being able to say, we want to take a step back and really identify what the problem is, what the need is, so that we can have a really strong strategy or a service that we're going to put in place to have those results. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. And I wanted to put a kind of a fine point on this. So we're talking about the difference between outputs and outcomes. I'm not going to go into a lengthy discussion on this, but this feels like one of those items that sometimes is confused, right? And we want to be really, really clear about what we mean by one versus the other. So outputs, we're also being hypersensitive to this because it's directly related to changes that are happening right now in the annual reporting process. So you're going to hear these terms used an awful lot in the coming months here. But on on the left, we've got outputs here, and these I sourced from the previous slides, so they should be a little bit familiar. So outputs consist of things like the weatherization services. So the services that we perform, those are outputs. Affordable housing units themselves, the units, their outputs, their items. All right. The more childcare slots, the childcare slots themselves are items. They're the outputs. They're the results, or the tangible effects of the services being completed. Okay. On the other hand, there's outcomes from each of these. Okay. So when we're looking at outcomes, if we're applying a weatherization service, an outcome may be that there's a decreased cost of a utility bill, right? As an example. So in the same breath, you could say that the outcome of this output, right, for this situation was a decreased cost of utility bill. These are also what you would see in the reporting areas, and what we're trying to get streamlined is that outcomes look like outcomes. And that one is in that family and individual area. Second area for the community could be increased supply of affordable housing, okay, as an outcome, right? And these are marking a change, something that's measured as change. So if we've measured a change in the utility bill, we've seen that there's a decrease in the utility bill from before applying weatherization services to after. Before the situation where we had too few affordable housing units, now we have an increased supply of affordable housing units. Okay, so that's the outcome. For the agency, in the last area here, if before we needed or we did not have enough childcare slots, the outcome, because we didn't have the funding, the outcome was that we've increased funding for childcare. Okay, so these outcomes are really what we're trying to achieve and tell the better story. Telling a story, and David kind of alluded to this, but telling the story of how we increase childcare slots, well, that's probably great if you care about the operations of the agency. If we talked about increasing funding for childcare, then you probably have a lot more people in the agency a little bit more excited about that. Same would hold true individually, right? So if I look at the weatherization services, if I receive the weatherization services, that may be well and good, but I'm really happy that my utility bill went down. Right? Probably also happy that I'm getting the effects of the weatherization service as well. You know, if that was a stated need. I'm too cold in winter, I'm too hot in summer. Okay. David, what thoughts do you have on outcomes and outputs? This is you know it's like a merry-go-round. We always hear this concept coming up.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what we hear a lot and we get is you say, well, it's simpler to measure outputs, and there's are times where a lot of times that outputs are important, and outputs are sometimes where funding sources really focus in. If you think about a program like Head Start, the output of children being in a classroom is a big measurement. It's a big part of the report. But one of the conversations we're talking about from the whole agency wide, it's being able to set those outcomes, which may be that a child is actually kindergarten ready. And you start thinking about, well, if that's really our focus, then you're starting to look at it changes the way you operate, because then we can talk about different systems when we get into the performance management of it. But part of that, the first step of that is establishing, why do you really run this program? What do you really want to be able to occur? And again, sometimes if we're talking about LIHEAP or utility assistance, yeah, it is about getting money out the door, getting that benefit there. That's just a part of the story. It's an okay part of the story. It definitely can drive the agency, and it can drive your stories about how successful you are. But we're saying outcomes when you identify the fact that maybe you are helping a mass amount of individuals that are elderly and they're able to remain in their own home for a substantial period of time because they have ongoing utility assistance. But you're establishing what those outcomes are, and the decreased cost of a utility bill also measures these other outcomes. And it's a different story you're able to tell. And a lot of times it's about helping people understand that this outcome is a preferred outcome versus a negative or we say a negative outcome. So we sometimes forget that when we're establishing this, and that's why it's so important. It helps tell the story. It helps you also measure what it is maybe that you need to do differently in your processes. So that's why it's so important to be able to say we're okay with being accountable. We want to be able to better understand these outcomes and the importance of them, and not just outputs. Outputs are great, but also including outcomes in that, and making sure that we clearly state that so that we have a way to measure us. If we have a way to measure us, then we have a way to increase our ability to deliver those outcomes.
Awesome. Yeah, and got a little activity. All right, so I promise this isn't going to be too invasive. And for those that are multitasking right now, I'd ask you to like pull up your chat, and just going to ask that we respond in chat. Okay. So this kind of pulls some things together. You know, as we're performing at the agency, you know, we're doing the work that we do, affecting individuals, families, communities, and our agency, building them, producing outcomes. It's good to keep all of that in mind. On the output side, it's easy to identify the output because it's kind of what it is that we do. The outcomes for a lot of us is kind of why it is that we do it, right? So let's take a look at some of these. We're going to have outputs for everything that we do because we report on that. Let's see what the outcomes are from these outputs. We're going to do this in two stages. The first thing is to identify which of those three categories does this belong to. Is this more of a family, individual output? Is it an agency output? Is it a community output? And the clue to that is that it's usually right there in the need itself, or the outcome, or the output statement itself. So if you look at that first one where it says individuals need transportation to get to work, what would you guess? What out of those three categories, individual, family, community, or agency, which of those do you think it is? Individual, family. All right. So yeah. All right. Okay. And I'm going to put F for family, just as shorthand, but F for family means individual and family. So we're getting pretty good at this game. And then if I'm going to turn that around from an output, what kind of outcome would I get? And I'm going to just show you these because it's good demonstrations, and you'll receive a copy of this deck. But individuals need transportation to get to work. The individuals acquire transportation, right? So we go from that need of needing transportation to the outcome of acquiring transportation. Now, there's probably an output somewhere in there. Any number of things we could have done to help that person acquire transportation. It could be vouchers, could be any kinds of services, and those would be the outputs. I misspoke a second ago. These are the needs, right? So there could be any number of outputs that get this. Exactly, Andy. Good call. So a bus token, a bike, exactly. So we could provide a lot of different outputs to achieve that outcome, but that's the outcome we're looking for. Individuals acquire transportation. Let's do another one. In the second one, staff lack skills to work with families in trauma, right? So if staff lack the skills, who's got the need? The agency. Yeah, all right. I think we might have some certified Roma folks in the room here, David. Okay, so the staff, the agency is the next one. And then if we take that need, the staff lacks the skills, then the staff would then have the skills. That's the outcome, is that the staff would have the skills. Third one here, there's not enough affordable housing in our community. What do you think? And you can just put the letter in there, F, A, or C. Yeah, okay, community, there we go, community. So the outcome here may look like the community increases its affordable housing units, right? If there's not enough, we've increased the number, okay? Number 4, families need housing they can afford. What do you think? F, 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 very good. So if they need the housing they can't afford, they secure affordable housing, right? That's the outcome there, okay? All right, number 5, we do not have housing program at our agency. All right, and then if we didn't have a housing program at our agency before, then the outcome would be that we do have a housing program at our agency. These are pretty straightforward, right? Like going from need to outcome is just satisfying the need, right? Without incorporating any services into that outcome statement. All right. Number 6, individuals need skills to prepare them for living wage jobs. Yeah. Individual, family. Very good. Very good. So if they didn't have the skills before, now they have the skills. So that's good. Number 7, children are not ready for school. Ooh, what do we think? Family. Very good. We tease by going to a very specific member of the family. All right. So if the children are not ready for school, then the children are ready for school. That's a good outcome. Okay. Let's come off mute for these last 3. Okay. I'll take a volunteer to give me an idea of what the outcome should be. So if number 8, senior citizens' homes are in disrepair, which threatens independence. Senior citizens' homes. Okay. So we're seeing that's family. That is family. All right. And so who would like to identify what do you think the outcome is? I'm going to come off mute. Adriana, what do you think?
Put me on the spot, Lauren. But yeah, so I feel that now it's seniors homes are
repaired.
And
Oh my goodness, absolutely right. Sometimes people get hung up on this one. You nailed it. That was a good job. All right. Very good. Yeah, senior citizens' homes are in good repair, and you didn't get distracted by that threatening independence, although I'm sure that they'll get some independence in there too. We'd have to address that as a different need. Number 9, families report food scarcity at least once a month. So that's
provided food.
Yeah, that's a family. And then this one's interesting. So the families report food scarcity less than once a month. And this one's pretty tricky because remember how food is difficult to achieve outcomes for? I don't know if does anybody run a food program? Yeah. So if you're trying to achieve outcomes, it's very tricky because you have to have that reporting component to that, right? So if you find a way of consistently reporting that for families about food scarcity, that may be a good way of demonstrating the outcome. It is notoriously challenging in food. All right. And then last one, there's no summer feeding programs in our community. Who'd like to try that?
That there would be summer feeding programs.
community.
In the community. Yeah, the community has summer feeding programs. Very good. All right. There's no tricking you guys. We're doing all right. Okay. So you'll see exercise very similar to this, almost identical to this. In the full introduction to Roma, and we talk even more deeply about how needs and outcomes are related, also how outputs are related to that. But we want to get into the recording. So good job there, team. Well done. I feel like we're moving in the right direction as it comes to outputs and outcomes. Okay. David, did you have any other comments on that? Outputs and outcomes before we get into who collects what?
You're good. Thanks.
Okay. Very nice. All right. Okay. Last couple of notes here. So we're getting into the last part, which is collecting and reporting on this data. Lots of stuff that's coming. None of what you see here is particular to annual report version 2 versus version 3. This is all going to hold the same, right? In fact, it may help if you're going to supply some comments on the annual report. So some of the benefits of collecting and reporting data are going to include it's required by the funders. So they're going to have some say in kind of what and how things get collected. It's going to tell the story of community action, right? Because we're here for the people, and this demonstrates our ability to affect the community in the ways that we designed. It demonstrates the agency's effort. So it's really good storytelling for the agency in identifying exactly how it is that you address the needs of the community. It provides evidence for lawmakers. When it comes to advocacy, this is your proof in the pudding that your programs are working and how well they're working and for whom. And then it proves returns on investments. So, we talked about the funders, but it's anybody who, not just investment of dollars, but also investment of time and energy. Think about your volunteer board. David, other benefits?
No,
Yeah.
you're right on it. I know I got the performance management, a couple of slides I want to talk about. So we'll talk about that benefit.
All right. Sounds good. Some of the barriers that we know exist include that it's sometimes difficult to collect data, sometimes near impossible to collect the data. When we talked about the food scarcity just a moment ago, can be very challenging to collect data. There may be system restrictions to how we collect data, particularly when changes happen, and we may need to have systems updated so that we've got the correct fields or the correct whatever to input the data into the systems to make sure that it's available for reporting. We are addressing a challenge right now with access to shared data. We recognize that that is an issue among data systems and aggregating data when it needs to be aggregated and how quickly that can happen. And then last couple items. One is a fear of disappointing stakeholders. This one, there can be some subtle psychology behind this. We see this in targeting, setting targets a lot. When we target what we expect to be the result, right? Instead of targeting what's available, we may cherry pick the results so that the stakeholders will see successful programs instead of less successful programs when that's not necessarily the intent of the reporting. And then an inadequate collection or process or workflow of collecting data. So if the folks who are supposed to collect data don't know that they're supposed to collect data, then we're going to have problems, right? Or they don't know where to put it, or they don't know how. All of those pieces need to be in order so that folks understand their role in the data collection process and why that's important. Okay. All right, David. How about for using the performance management data?
Yeah, so when we talk about whole agency and the data that you're using, when you are able to really clearly identify each steps of this logic model and what you're trying to do, there's data in each piece of that, right? There's data in developing what the needs are. So when you're talking about grant writing, you're able to tell your story, you're able to go after funding because you say, here's a deep dive and a true definition of what our need is. The other piece that we want to talk about is when you start to look at outcomes, and Lawrence hit on that, and I know he's going to hit on it a little bit later, it's being able to very clearly and truly articulate the information about what it really takes for you to operate and have successful outcomes. So while we talk about being able to, again, administer a certain amount of services, get those dollars out the door, but what do those services mean and how are they tied to the actual outcome? And what does it realistically take? And I know Lawrence is going to talk a little bit about that later. But it really helps from performance management data or using the data from a service delivery system standpoint for two different ways. First of all, when you use that process across the agency, let's say a department that you have has 10 employees and those 10 employees are working with these families to have outcomes. How are you able to say or be able to better understand out of those 10 employees which one are more successful at reaching those outcomes if you haven't truly set those? And let's say, again, you need to reach 200 outcomes, or your target is to hit 200 outcomes. And then you're able to divide that up and say, I have 5 employees. Well, I have 5 employees supposed to hit 200 outcomes. So that means on average, they should hit 40 outcomes apiece. Well, if you have the data that says how many people I have to have applied to hit that outcome, let's say it's 400, then you know you need to recruit 400 people for this program by each person. And you're able to use all those different data points to say, maybe this staff member needs additional help in getting applications in. Maybe we need different marketing or communications in the area that they serve. But also you're able to look at it and say, I have one staff member that operates and sees 400 people and they get 20 outcomes. And I have another one that operates and sees 400 people and they get 60 outcomes. Maybe I should put those folks together to see if there's a difference in the staffing work and the way that they operate. Or maybe you also find out that it's a different set of services that I offer. So you're saying that I'm trying to get a housing outcome that someone stays in their home for 180 days. And let's say you have one set of folks that get a certain subset of services that offer, and you reach those outcomes. but then you have another set of families that only get these 2 or 3 services and they're not reaching those outcomes. Well, that just gives you more information to say, oh, we need to always check to make sure that this family has this service need met. Or if we have enough of them that don't, maybe then again, that brings in and starts you a new logic model. So that's using that performance data to be able to do that. But also on the other side of that is it really allows you as well to manage that workflow and expectation. When we start talking about spending a certain amount of dollars, we're talking about targeting. One of the biggest issues that we see when you're not using a really clear laid out plan is that you don't have that forecasting in place. So if you know that an average social worker or a customer service person can only see, let's say, 10 families a day, and you know that you need to see at least 80 clients a day to reach these outcomes, but you only have 4 staff, it doesn't work. It doesn't realistically add up, right? You're not going to hit those numbers. And so being able to do that and use this performance data also allows you to correctly plan out the programs and then measure as those dollars are spent. A lot of us use this on some basic elements. We'll say, I have $2 million to spend. I need to spend this much per week. But it's also taking that next step when you start saying, this is how many outputs, and these are what outcomes it's going to service. And I can use that information. And that's where you start looking at it from a whole wide standpoint, but it's putting those processes in place. Last thing I'll say on that is, of course, in order to be able to do that, you have to take a strong look at all your policies. If you have a standard operating procedure in the way that you take in clients, you start looking at your human resources policies and how you're putting on your job descriptions, what are things that you're going to evaluate and work with your all your staff on. You start looking at your fiscal policies and how you're doing reporting out to say, we need to be able to track exactly how much we're spending in this area, because we want to make that program better for the next year. Once you put this system in place, it allows you that flexibility to do those type of things. So thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks, David. And we're getting pretty close to the end. I know we've gone over time just a little bit, but I've got a couple of items here that may help reinforce the point. One of those things is that a lot of times when we're targeting, we feel like we need to be 100% successful every time, all the time. And that's just not reality with most industries. Okay, so I wanted to go through this very quickly just to give you an idea of what reality is like in different industries so that you can very comfortably target based on what you think will actually happen, not on having just 100% completion on everything. So for instance, new magazines. Only 3 in 10, or about 30% of new magazines make it, right? Movies, we're looking at 1 in 5 turn a profit. On Broadway, also 1 in 5 turn a profit. Prescription drugs, hold on. 1 in 5,000 prescription drugs go to market and fund all the rest of that stuff, right? Profitable prescription drugs are 15 to 20%. So 1 in 5,000 that are in development hit the market. Only 15 to 20% of that 1 in 5,000 are actually profitable. So there's a head scratcher. New business startups. About half will make it, half will fail. Retail sales, we're looking at 1 in 5 or 20% of retail establishments will hit targets. And then on-time railroad delivery. This one was interesting. So this is delivery, not Amtrak, not pedestrian, but on-time railroad delivery. You get a little flexibility here. You got plus or minus 24 hours to be considered on time for railroad delivery. So just to give you some idea across different industries, the target is never really to hit 100 out of 100. The target is to hit as many as you can out of what's available, okay? And then do better next time or adjust for next time, right? So target with confidence. And then I wanted to identify very quickly here, looking just at some of the common roles that we see across the organization at an agency, and then what responsibility that role has in the data collection process, right? And they're all over the place. Some of it's going to be client data, some of it's internal, some of it's community, right? But it's all important because you roll it into your next assessment process. So if my role is to intake new clients, I'm going to collect client personal identifying information, probably among other things, but I'm certainly going to collect that. If I'm a caseworker, I'm going to look at the client progress and record that. I'm going to record any referral information. So looking into other organizations that we connect to and programs that we connect to. If I have a fiscal role, I'm far more internal, probably. I'll be looking at invoices, receipts, statements. Those are data items that I'm collecting. For those that have been through an audit, that's going to be really important information to have on hand. Operations are going to focus on utilization data. And then they're also going to look at operational gaps, right? Thinking of things like process improvement, which is very important. So they'll collect data on the process itself. Okay, and that's very internal. For planning, the planners are going to look at needs assessments. So that's where you get your community needs assessments. They'll look at past reporting. So that kind of information is important to collect. And then at the bottom, we've got HR. So HR is going to look at the staff PII, the personal identifying information, and then other elements outside of PII. But then, as HR, you're looking at internal staff related data that's being collected. Now, all of those pieces of data, they could be very disparate. You could be looking at some that's really agency related, some that's client related, some that will help with planning for the actual services that are provided. Some of it will be planning for how the agency is going to provide those services and make it available to the community. So there are lots of different ways that we use data. It's not just for the annual report. It's not just for funder reporting. We use a lot of this information and data that we collect in a number of different ways and cross-reference it. Right? A lot like David was talking about earlier when you're establishing how many people you're going to need to put toward some particular service or program that the agency is operating. It's important to take a look at all aspects of the business to figure that out, right? So everybody contributes to that, even though they may not see how that data is ultimately utilized. It's important to collect, and it's important for folks to know that it's important to collect. It's a little meta, but without everybody rowing their oars at the same time, the boat doesn't go as fast. Right? So we want to keep everything in ship shape and get that rowing team going. Whew. All right, so we learned an awful lot of stuff today. And like I mentioned before, everybody will receive a copy of the deck. We encourage you to take a look at future ROMA training opportunities. If there are folks that want to go through certification at your agency, by all means, let me know and we'll help move you through that process. We've got cool stuff coming for the balance of the year on certification, ROMA certification. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. And then we're always happy to come through to agencies to perform the introduction to ROMA course as you see fit and as you see valuable for your agency. And we'll schedule that as necessary. And we really look forward to coming through and talking ROMA to agencies, bring you up to speed. Another practice that lots of agencies go through is developing logic models for all of their programs. So keep that in mind as well. There's a lot of support for that out in the field. Let me know if you have questions about that process. And then last thing, if you would be so kind, because we are interested in collecting data here as well, if you'd take 2 minutes and provide a little feedback on today's presentation. The QR code is there on the screen if you want to use your phone. And then I've dropped the link in the chat if you prefer a browser version of that. Okay, and I believe David had to jump off for another meeting, but thank you all for participating today. Really look forward to seeing your feedback. And we'll send out copies of the presentation deck and the recording when they're available. Does anybody have any questions before you leave? I'm happy to answer them now.
I don't have a question, but I would just like to say thank you very much. I really appreciated the updated slides. It made it much more engaging, and the training very eye-opening, even for someone who's been here as long as I have. So thank you. I definitely appreciate it.
Thanks, Andy. All right, folks.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you so much. This was really helpful and really easy to understand. Looking forward to get the training for Roma in our agency. So thank you.
Nice. Yeah, you're welcome. All right. I think that'll do it, everybody. Have a great day.